So in 1991, I visited Prague in Czechoslovakia. It was called then. It was 2 years after the Velvet Revolution, 2 years after the Berlin Wall, and so on. And the belief at that point was in the West. The belief was that capitalism had triumphed, that capitalism had defeated communism. And so that gave capitalism became, in the words of a Japanese American, it was the end of history. In other words, people had reached perfection. We had the perfect system. The capitalist system, there was nothing more to learn. The very arrogance of that statement is extraordinary, but in fact, he was completely and totally wrong. And the belief that capitalism had triumphed was completely and totally wrong. There may have been a battle between a Cold War, between capitalism and communism, or between America and Russia or the Soviet Union, but capitalism didn't triumph, balance triumphed. And by that I mean that the Eastern European countries were totally out of balance. I may repeat a bit from the morning, but were totally out of balance on the side of their public sectors. Government was much too powerful in Eastern Europe. Whereas in the United States and Europe and Canada and the successful Western countries, they were in balance in the sense that the private sector was very strong in each of these countries, but the public sector was very strong. And there was a third sector I call the plural sector, or civil society, the sector made up of all those organizations and institutions that are neither public nor private. And as I said this morning, there's a huge number of those. So there was a balance. If you think about the United States in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson talked about the just society, there were many welfare programs for poor Americans. Many welfare programs for poor Americans. And tax rates were very high in America. And yet the American economy did extremely well. Okay? And then the wall fell down, and then capitalism triumphed, and then it was the end of history. And what happened is that capitalism did triumph. And that threw America out of balance on the other side. So whereas the Soviet Union was out of balance on the side of the public sector, America and much of the West, especially Great Britain and so on, went out of balance on the side of the private sector. And that is now destroying democracy in America and many other countries. Because too many people have been pressured by globalization, which is the main manifestation of the triumph of capitalism, is the power of global corporations. There's nothing constraining the power of global corporations. There's no significant global government that constrains the power of global corporations. So nothing constrains globalization except one thing, and that is the votes of very angry people. And those are the people who elect Trump, who elect Orban in Hungary, who elect Bolsonaro in Brazil, who vote Brexit in Britain, and so on and so forth. It's their revenge, except they're not solving their problem, because Trump is not going to fix the problem of poor Americans. But there's been that kind of shift in the voting patterns of people. And so what we're facing are all these new countries, not new countries, but all these countries that are shifting to extreme positions. And it doesn't matter if it's the right wing, as you find in Brazil, or the left wing, as you find in Venezuela, or the religious part, as you find in Turkey. An autocrat is an autocrat. And people who seize power and do everything they can to hold power, it doesn't matter whether they come under the excuse of left or right. You know, Trump may not like Venezuela, and he might like Bolsonaro in Brazil, because somehow he thinks one's right-wing and the other's left-wing. It really doesn't make that much difference. It's a question of the destruction of democracy, and Trump is part of that. And Trump he's more constrained than, He can't get away with it the way they do in Venezuela and so on. There are more constitutional constraints. But if he could reduce those, he would, and he does. He does what he can. For example, the constitutional constraint that enables Congress or the House of Representatives to control budgeting, he just ignores it. He wants to build his wall and the hell with Congress. So he doesn't have much respect for democracy. And Erdogan in Turkey doesn't have much respect for democracy. And Orban in Hungary doesn't have much respect for democracy. So this is the world we face today. And the way I describe it kind of metaphorically is if you have a stool, like, you know, a chair or a stool, like you sit in a bar, you know, to drink beer and sit on a stool, you can't balance it on one leg. And I don't care if that leg is communism or capitalism or pluralism. Because you have, in different countries, you have that one leg that's dominant. And so what we've had in the more democratic countries is two legs. Okay? We have left and right, government and markets. And we swing back and forth between the two. So you have some countries that go back and forth. In Britain, it's Labour and Conservative. France, until Macron, was between the left and the right. And I call it pendulum politics. I also call it political paralysis because when Obama was elected, let's call him moderate left, he was totally blocked by the right in Congress. And you see in country after country that when a new government comes in, first of all, the opposition tries to stop the old government. So in Brazil, you impeached Dilma. Dilma was impeached on the left, so the government came in on the right. You try and block them. Or you cancel their legislation. So the left enacts regulations or climate change, and the right comes in and wipes it out. And what you get is political paralysis, but not economic paralysis. Because the private sector is free to do what it likes. It can do what it likes. Even during Obama's realm or period, when he was moderately left, the government, the private sector had enormous power. In Canada, we have a government that's kind of left of center, and we have a prime minister who believes we have to deal with global warming, and he's a big fan of pipelines. He wants to build pipelines to carry the dirtiest oil in the world to market, because he doesn't want to lose votes. So this is the world we're living in. Who's going to solve that? Who's going to deal with this imbalance? Well, if you ask many people in the United States, they say business has to solve the problem. In America, if you have a problem, business has to solve the problem. But business is the problem to a large extent. I don't mean every businessman is bad or every businesswoman is bad. I don't mean that at all. There are lots of responsible businesses. There are lots of wonderful businesses. But anybody who thinks that corporate social responsibility will compensate for all the corporate social irresponsibility that we see today is dreaming. Okay? And so business is not, and the global corporations are not going to give up the enormous power they now have. internationally. They're not going to say, gee, we were wrong and we need balance and we need stronger government. A few say that. Like, what's his name? Buffett is kind of quite responsible. He says, you need to tax me more. I pay less tax than my secretary. Okay, that's really good. It's responsible. But they're not exactly lining up to follow him that way. Business is not going to give up all the power that it's gained. So business is not going to solve the problem. So other people say, well, government has to solve the problem. After all, why do we elect governments? We elect governments to serve us, to solve our problems. That's fine, except governments are so co-opted by private forces that they're blocked. And what you have in 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States had a ruling on Citizens United, it was called. And what Citizens United did was it opened the door to corporate donations, corporate and anybody donations, wealthy people, corporations, unions, anything, to political donations. And what it did was it legalized bribery. The Supreme Court of the United States legalized bribery. Democracy is dying in the United States because even Democrats have to raise money from people who don't necessarily want to give up power. They may be, if they're donating to the Democratic Party, they may be more liberal than if they're donating to the Republican Party, but there's still constraints on what people can do. Companies have bought off Congress. Pharmaceutical companies have bought off Congress. The National Rifle Association has bought off Congress. America is no longer the democracy it was. America was the model for 200 years. For 200 years, following 1789, America was the model of democracy. Okay? America is no longer the model of democracy, and we have trouble appreciating that. And shareholder value is the worst part of it. No, not the worst part. A bad part of it. And the idea that people are promoting shareholder value in Japan is an aberration. And I think that's what Hiro Tammy would say. Because it's not about shareholders. It's about everybody. And in fact, the most successful companies deal with their employees first and have motivated and interested and respected employees. They in turn treat customers well and design good products. That in turn brings profit, and that's what makes companies successful. You don't start with shareholder value. You end with shareholder value, and you get more shareholder value in the long run. Okay? This is a quote from Keynes, and I know exactly what it says because I put it down. Keynes was a famous economist, and Keynes said famously, "In the long run, we're all dead." Well, what does he mean by we? He doesn't mean we as a species. He means each of us, not all of us. He means each of us will die. But right now we're facing a crisis of global warming and the proliferation of nuclear weapons where in the short run we may all be dead. All of us together, collectively, may all be dead. But economists don't recognize community. They don't recognize this idea of collectivity. They don't recognize that. It's all about individualism, and individualism is killing us. The unholy alliance that controls our thinking today is that greed is good, self-interest is good, markets are sacred, markets are everything, and governments are suspect. Be careful of governments, rely on markets, be greedy, and everything will be fine. Well, that's a perverse philosophy. When I meet an economist who says there's no such a thing as benevolence, I say, what kind of mother did you have? Okay? Because mothers are benevolent. They don't think of themselves. They think of their children. And they think of the future. And when economists say there's no benevolence, I said, you must have had a horrible mother if you never saw benevolence. So this is the dominating philosophy today, and it's destroying us. And what we have is rampant self-interest. We have self-interest, serving myself, out of control. But not in Japan. Japan was really interesting, because what I decided visiting Japan on this trip, I sort of came like, this feels like a balanced country. Japan feels like a balanced country to me. Things work. Employees they serve. They're enthusiastic. They're energetic. I don't find people on the street begging for money. I don't find workers who just kind of, leave me alone. I find a different kind of attitude. And what I concluded is, I mentioned it this morning anyway, but what I concluded is that it's not individualism is so minimal in Japan, it's that individualism is so rampant everywhere else that in comparison, Japan is a balanced country because it controls the level of individualism. I don't get the feeling that everybody conforms and nobody's allowed to express themselves. I don't get that feeling. But when I go into the States, or even in Canada to a lesser extent, I find that individualism is just out of control. Absolutely out of control. It's all kinds of stories like that. So, this is what's going on in America today because of this imbalance. The statistics on America, you can take any one of them. Take longevity. Longevity, how long you live. It's always been going up because of healthcare, going down in the United States now. In Japan, it's the highest in the world. Okay? Take income disparities, the spread between poor people and rich people. The highest in the developed world, and maybe the world, in the United States. In Japan, relatively lower. Okay? So, this is what's happening. These are the consequences. Okay. So, as I said, you can't balance a chair on two legs. Because what you get, I have to show you this. I think this is wonderful. I have to find out what the other side says. But this is a book I bought called The Communist Manifesto, famous book by Karl Marx and Engels. And I read it years ago when I was writing my book. And then I went back to it to look at it again. And then I noticed, you noticed something about that book? There's a sticker that the bookstore put on the book. And it says, 2 for the price of 1. Marx must be turning in his grave. They're selling the Communist Manifesto 2 for the price of 1. I don't know what the other one is. I don't know if the other one is, Dracula or something. But the other one should be von Hayek or Milton Friedman, 2 for the price of 1. I have to find out what the Japanese equivalent is. That represents the world on 2 legs. Okay? It's the public leg and the private leg, or it's governments and markets, or it's left and right. Whatever it is, everything is linear politics. And what you get is pendulum politics, as I said. Goes back and forth, not very healthy. Not in Japan, because you kind of stay roughly in the same place. Probably healthier. And you get paralysis. Obama was elected on the slogan of yes, we can, and he ended up dealing with no, we can't. Because Congress wouldn't let him do things. And so a healthy society balances itself on 3 legs. A stool, a chair, needs at least 3 legs for balance. And 1 leg is public and 1 leg is private, and the 3rd leg I call plural. And if one is governments and the other is businesses or markets, then the 3rd one is communities. Okay? And that sector is huge and obscure. It's huge. In many countries, the number of organizations like NGOs, non-government organizations, or non-owned, what I call non-owned organizations. My university, nobody owns my university. Nobody owns KO University. Okay? These organizations are owned by nobody. Many of your hospitals are owned by nobody. Or maybe they're owned by a church or a religious organization. But they're not owned by investors. You do have hospitals here that are owned by investors. Or cooperatives. You have a chain, a supermarket chain called Co-op, which is owned by the members. If you shop there, you're a member. You own it. Okay? And those are not investors, but those are people who shop there. And in the United States, the center of free enterprise, there are more cooperative memberships than there are people. So there are 330 million Americans and 350 million co-op memberships in the United States. It's huge. It's huge. Interesting situation in Japan, because it's not quite as big. Maybe co-ops are, but not the non-owned part. But it's obscure. It doesn't exist because it's all about left and right. It's all about left and right. But you need the third leg for balance, and the plural sector is the key to balance. And the plural sector is all those organizations that, as I say, are owned by members or owned by nobody, or they're social movements, like people go out in the street and protest. That's plural sector, and so on. There are many, many, many of those things going on. So it's huge. And who makes up the plural sector? Everybody in this room. Everybody. Because you might work in business, you might vote for government or work in government, but every one of you has associations with plural sector organizations, whether it's a club or some, you're part of a hospital that's not for profit, or you work for Greenpeace, or you donate money to Greenpeace. I maintain, I don't know about here, but in Canada, I don't know anybody who doesn't interact with more than 5 plural sector organizations every week. Okay, my university, every time I go to my university, that's plural sector organization. If I go to the YMCA to work out, to do exercise, that's plural sector. Nobody owns it. Okay? If I donate to Doctors Without Borders, that's plural sector. It's huge, but obscure. And until we recognize, until we recognize that we need a third leg for balance, we won't change anything. Business will not solve the problem. Government will not solve the problem. The plural sector won't solve the problem, but it'll start the solution. It'll start the solution. And then governments have to be involved, and businesses have to be involved, but the three of them together. But the beginning will have to be here. The Reformation in the church in 16th century Germany started with Martin Luther nailing his criticisms of the church onto one church. And that started the Reformation. And people were so angry with what went on that the change happened very, very quickly. And it started in the plural sector. The church is in the plural sector itself. The church is not owned by investors. It's not owned by governments. But it can be corrupted. And the church in those days was corrupted. And people were angry. And so they had an effect. And so we had that kind of change. Okay. By the way, the reason I call it the plural sector is because, number one, I want public-private plural, so people can see it with the others. And the second reason is there's so many different associations. The National Rifle Association is not a very nice organization, but it's plural sector. It's not owned by government. It's not owned by investors. It's controlled maybe by private individuals who manufacture guns, but it's officially plural sector. So there's all kinds of organizations in the plural sector, and that's why we call it plural. Okay, so what's a balanced society look like? Or what's an unbalanced society look like? An unbalanced society is, you have three choices for an unbalanced society. You can have state despotism, as you have in many countries today, where you have autocrats controlling the country. Okay, as you've seen in, I don't know, Nicaragua today, Venezuela, and so on. You can have predatory capitalism, which I think is what's happening in the United States today. Or you can have exclusive populism, where you have populist groups, as in Hungary, but they're not including everybody in the plural sector. They're only including their own group in the plural sector. Or you can have balanced society, where the democracy is engaging, the enterprises are responsible, and the community attitude is engaging. Okay. So, what do we have in the world today? We have just a few balanced societies. I would include my own country, Canada, relatively speaking. I think the Scandinavian, Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, and they're the most democratic countries in the world, according to lists now. They're quite democratic. Then you have the classic liberal democracies, like in America and Britain. But as I said earlier, they're less and less liberal, and more in favor of private wealth. Then you have the illiberal democracies, which is the expression by Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who says we are an illiberal democracy. It doesn't take much to go from an illiberal democracy to an autocracy. Okay? And then you've got three superpowers, same old three superpowers that want to control the world. But they're all a problem now. They're all a problem. And as I said this morning, I think it's a big mistake for any decent country like Japan to throw support behind someone like Trump. Because it's not a question of each country looking after itself. It's a question of the decent countries of the world getting together and stopping the global warming problems, stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and stopping what the superpowers are doing to grab influence around the world. So as I say, the real change has to begin in the plural sector, and that means you and me. We're the plural sector. In other words, you may be the president of a big company, or you may be the prime minister, or whatever, but it's what you do personally on the ground, not what you're going to talk about or go to Paris and pass the COP21 to stop global warming. COP21 in Paris took a pledge, a long-term pledge. These were politicians who would all be gone in 4 years, and they were committing their countries to deal with global warming. I mean, how stupid can we be? How stupid can we be that elected politicians are committing their successors to a program? I mean, we're stupid. It can't possibly happen. They're not committing their successors. They're making a show. This is what's happening. Change has to begin on the ground, and that means here, and that means today. It seems to me today's a good time to start. No, better than tomorrow. I made a list of all the ideas I could think about myself, and I made it so nobody could read it, because somebody might come along in 10 years and say, "Did you say that?" Okay, so I took it out, and what I did is I said, here's a few answers to the Irene question. And on the left side is the personal, what can I do? The plural, what can we do? The private, what can our companies do? The public, what can our governments do? The planet, what can we all do together? Okay? I won't bother with the top, but so what I did was we made this chart. I didn't make it. I don't know how to do this stuff. Free the corporate press. In Canada, we don't have a free press. We have a corporate press. In the last 2 elections, every English language newspaper came out for the Conservative Party except one. That's not a free press. That's a corporate press. How can we have democracy when the press is completely controlled by business? And not only is it controlled by business, but it's directed in its behavior by business. The New York Times is thankfully a balanced newspaper, I think. And it would come out Democratic or Republican depending. But you probably all know about public-private partnerships. Well, we could have more public-private plural partnerships. We need to include the plural sector in the partnerships. We do, but we pretend it's part of the private, but it's not. We need public-private plural partnerships. We need a peace council. Did I talk about the Insecurity Council this morning? Yeah, that the Security Council of the United Nations is an insecurity council. And I mentioned this morning that what your country should be doing is getting together with countries that are decent democracies, that are balanced democracies, and trying to find some way that we can stop the kind of things that go on now. That the prince in Saudi Arabia does what he likes and gets away with it is awful. How can we let that happen? How can we? He goes even into other countries like Turkey and murders one of his people. How can we let that happen? What kind of world do we have? So this is the chart, okay? And your job, forget the top. The top just means that we can change our beliefs, we can fix things, or we can do new things, okay? But your job right now is to fill this in, okay? You come up in your workshops with, it's not what could I do, it's what am I going to do? What are we going to do? What can we really do?